The iron mug was loud in the way only shared spaces between enemies could be. Too much laughter, too many voices talking over one another, the brittle sound of peace pretending it wasn't built on centuries of blood. Orcs drank hard at one end of the tavern. Humans clustered stiffly at the other, and everyone pretended not to notice how hands hovered a little too close to weapons. Raska of the Blackhide clan noticed everything, and tonight she was bored enough to be cruel about it. She leaned back in her chair, boots hooked on the table. Tusk grinned sharp as she scanned the room for something. Anything to break the monotony. That was when she saw him, a human alone at the far edge of the tavern, thin shoulders hunched over a book far too large for his hands, ink-stained fingers turning pages with reverent care while chaos roared around him. He looked like the kind of man who apologized when people stepped on his foot, the kind who survived wars by hiding in libraries while others bled. Raska snorted into her mug. "Look at that," she muttered to her friends. Someone let a scholar wander into the wrong den. A few orcs followed her gaze and chuckled. "Bet he squeals if you breathe on him," one said. Another laughed. "5 silver says he drops that book and runs." Raska drained her mug and stood, stretching to her full height, armor shifting with a familiar, comforting weight. It wasn't hatred that moved her feet, not really. It was boredom and the reckless arrogance that came with knowing she was bigger, stronger, and feared. She grabbed a fresh tankard from the bar and crossed the tavern without breaking stride, conversations faltering as her shadow stretched long across the floor. The human didn't look up until she was already there. His eyes widened slightly, not in terror, but surprise, like someone interrupted mid-thought. Raska set the tankard down hard beside his book and dropped into the chair next to him without asking, the wood creaking under her weight. "Mind if I sit?" she said, grinning, already enjoying the moment before the fear set in. It didn't. The human blinked once, then twice, and shook his head. "No," he said politely. "I was almost finished with this chapter anyway." That threw her. He didn't scramble back, didn't flinch, didn't even tense. He simply shifted his book to give her space, like she was an inconvenience, not a threat. Raska leaned closer, tusks catching the light. "You know where you are, right?" she asked, voice low and rough. "I do," he replied, eyes back on the page. "The iron mug. It has better lighting than most taverns." She frowned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She leaned in further, close enough that he should have smelled the iron on her armor, the sweat, the faint bloodstain she hadn't scrubbed off yet. "You're not scared," she said. He paused, considering. Should I be? The question landed wrong, not defiant, not mocking, genuinely curious. Raska opened her mouth to answer with something sharp, something intimidating, and that was when she felt it. Heat. Not the warmth of bodies packed into a room or the hearth burning behind the bar, but something deeper, heavier, like standing too close to a forge. It rolled off him in slow waves, prickling her skin beneath armor, crawling up her arms and settling uncomfortably in her chest. Her grin faltered. She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how close she was. The human looked up then, finally noticing her discomfort. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look warm." Raska stared at him, pulse quickening. The heat intensified, impossible wrong. No one else reacted. No one else noticed. Laughter continued, mugs clanged, and the world went on as if nothing was happening. Slowly, Raska realized the joke had ended without her permission. Whatever this was, it wasn't about scaring a human anymore. It was about something burning quietly beneath his skin, and for reasons she didn't yet understand, she was the only one who could feel it. Raska pulled back just enough to convince herself she was imagining it, that the strange heat pressing against her skin was nothing more than the tavern's closeness or her own body reacting to too much ale and too little patience. She shifted in her chair, rolling her shoulders beneath her armor, but the warmth followed her movement like a living thing, clinging to the space between her and the human. It wasn't sharp or painful, yet, but dense, wrong, the way air feels before a storm breaks. She glanced around, half expecting to see others sweating or backing away, but the iron mug carried on unchanged. Orcs laughed. Humans whispered. A barmaid pushed past with a tray of drinks, oblivious. No one noticed the invisible furnace sitting calmly beside her. Raska's jaw tightened. She leaned back in again, slower this time, testing the distance like a hunter probing a trap. The heat intensified immediately, blooming outward from the human's chest and shoulders, seeping through leather and steel as if her armor didn't exist. Her skin prickled beneath it. Her breath caught. This wasn't fear. She knew fear intimately, but unease, sharp and unfamiliar. "What are you doing?" she demanded, keeping her voice low. The human looked up, startled. "Reading," he said, lifting the book slightly as if to prove it. The heat flared again, and Raska hissed under her breath, jerking back an inch. He noticed that. His brows knit together in concern. "Did I offend you?" he asked. "I can move if—" "No," she snapped, then forced herself to slow. She did not like how easily this was rattling her. "You're warm," she said carefully. He blinked. "Am I?" He pressed his fingers briefly to his own wrist, then shrugged. "I suppose the room is crowded." The heat surged at the dismissal, and Raska clenched her fists. Crowded didn't explain this. Crowded didn't feel like standing too close to a forge at full burn. She leaned forward again, jaw set, refusing to be chased off by something she didn't understand. The warmth pressed harder, thickening the air, and sweat beaded at her temples. She could feel it in her bones now, a low thrum that made her instincts scream danger without pointing to a blade or spell. "You don't feel it," she said, accusation slipping into her tone. He shook his head slowly. "I've felt worse," he replied, a strange honesty in his voice. "This is manageable." That answer chilled her more than the heat itself. "Worse than this?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes dropping back to the page, fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the book. "Yes," he said quietly. The fire answered that word with a slow, heavy pulse, as if confirming it. Raska swallowed, suddenly aware that she was breathing shallowly. She scanned him more carefully now, the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the way his movements were precise, economical, as if he rationed effort. He wasn't trembling or sweating. He wasn't in pain, not outwardly. He was simply enduring. "How long have you been like this?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked up again, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Like what?" The heat swelled, irritated, and Raskin nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. "You're burning," she said bluntly. "You're burning, and you don't even know it." For a moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, then something closer to resignation, but it vanished almost instantly. "You must be mistaken," he said gently, the way one humors a drunk. "People would have noticed." Raska's gaze snapped to the room again. No one was watching. No one cared. The realization settled heavy and cold in her gut. Whatever this fire was, it belonged to him alone, hidden in plain sight. She leaned back at last, heart pounding, and understood with unsettling clarity that the joke she'd come here to make had never been on him at all. It had been on her, for thinking she could sit beside a dying man and walk away unchanged. Raska expected fear to arrive eventually. It always did. Humans, even the bold ones, always reached a moment where their courage faltered, where their eyes darted, their shoulders tightened, and their voice thinned under the weight of realizing just how fragile they were. She waited for that moment as she sat beside him, heat pressing against her like a warning she couldn't escape. But it never came. Instead, the human turned another page with careful fingers and frowned, not at her, but at a line of text that seemed to displease him. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said suddenly, glancing up at her. The concern in his voice caught her off guard. "What?" "You're breathing too fast," he explained. "And you're flushed. If you're feeling unwell, you should move closer to the door. The air's better there." Raska stared at him. "You think I'm the one in danger?" He tilted his head, studying her face with the same focus he'd been giving the book. "You look uncomfortable," he said simply. "I didn't mean to cause that." The heat surged in response, rolling outward in a thick wave that made her skin crawl. Raska clenched her teeth and forced herself not to move. "You're not afraid of me," she said again, slower this time. He smiled faintly, not unkindly. "I don't see the point," he replied. "If you wanted to hurt me, you would have already. Fear wouldn't change that." The logic was disarming in its simplicity. She had spent years cultivating terror as a shield and a weapon, and here was a man who treated it like wasted effort. "Most humans would be screaming by now," she said. He shrugged. "Most humans haven't spent years learning how to sit still while something inside them screams instead." The words landed hard, and the fire pulsed sharply, as if reacting to being named without consent. Raska's jaw tightened. "You talk like this is normal," she said. "Like it's something you just live with." He hesitated, and for the first time she saw a crack in his composure. Not fear, fatigue. Bone deep, unrelenting fatigue. "You learn to," he said quietly. "At first you fight it. Then you plan around it. Eventually, you stop thinking of it as an enemy and start thinking of it as weather." The heat shifted, no longer flaring, but heavy and constant, like a storm that had settled in for the long haul. Raska leaned back, studying him with new eyes. "What happens when the storm breaks?" she asked. He met her gaze, calm in a way that felt earned rather than naive. "Then it breaks," he said. "Worrying about it won't stop it from coming." The fire swelled at that, and Raska felt a strange, uncomfortable respect take root in her chest. She had seen warriors face death screaming, bargaining, cursing the world for daring to take them. This human faced it the way one faced a long night, by accepting it and conserving strength for the hours that mattered. "You're strange," she muttered. He smiled a little wider this time. "I've been told." The heat softened, and for a moment it almost felt like warmth shared rather than a threat. Raska realized then that the most unsettling thing about him wasn't the fire burning beneath his skin. It was the fact that he had made peace with it, and that his lack of fear left no room for her own. Raska did not ask for the truth all at once. She learned it the way one learned the shape of a blade in the dark, by careful touch, by noticing where the edge cut deepest. It began with small questions asked between sips of ale and long stretches of silence, questions that sounded harmless enough to anyone listening. How often did he sleep? Did the heat ever turn to pain? Had he always felt this way, or was it something that came later? Each answer added weight to the fire pressing against her, and slowly the shape of it emerged, sharp and undeniable. "It wasn't always like this," he admitted one night, eyes fixed on the hearth rather than her face. "When I was younger, it came and went. Fevers, weakness. Everyone said I'd grow out of it." The heat pulsed at the memory, restless. "You didn't," Raska said. He shook his head. "No, it grew with me instead." The tavern noise faded into background hum as he spoke, and Raska realized how rarely anyone listened long enough to hear him finish a thought. "The scholars have a name for it," he continued. "They call it the living ember. A curse bound to bloodlines, passed quietly from parent to child. It speeds everything up: heart, breath, thought. You burn brighter than you should, but for less time." The fire flared at the name, as if acknowledging itself. Raska's jaw clenched. "And no one does anything?" she demanded. He shrugged, a small, tired motion. "They try at first. Healers, mages, priests. When it doesn't kill you quickly, they lose interest. Long deaths are inconvenient." The word struck harder than any insult. Raska glanced around the tavern, the packed tables, the laughter, the life, and saw it differently now. He had been sitting in plain sight all along, burning quietly while the world looked elsewhere. "How long?" she asked. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "I don't know. My mother lasted 40 years. Her sister barely made 25. It changes. It adapts." The heat thickened, and Raska felt it sink deeper into her chest, like a weight she hadn't agreed to carry but could no longer ignore. "You never told anyone?" she pressed. He met her gaze then, something fragile flickering behind his calm. "People don't stay when they know," he said. "They start measuring time. Every conversation becomes a goodbye." The fire eased slightly, as if approving of the secrecy. Raska leaned back, breathing carefully. "So you sit here," she said slowly, "letting people think you're weak, strange, forgettable." He smiled faintly. "It's easier than watching them grieve early." The simplicity of that choice unsettled her more than the curse itself. Strength, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet decision to endure without burdening anyone else. "You're wrong," she said abruptly. He frowned. "About what?" "About being forgettable," she replied. The heat responded, a low, steady thrum that felt almost like agreement. Raska understood then that the curse wasn't just hidden from the world. It was protected by his silence, by a kindness that asked nothing and demanded no witness. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, she found herself unwilling to let it stay that way. Raska told herself she would not return to the iron mug the next night. She told herself that knowing the truth changed nothing, that she had no place sitting beside a human slowly burning from the inside, that warriors survived by choosing which fights were theirs and which were not. All day the city proved her right. Training drills, patrol routes, the familiar ache of muscles used hard and often. Life moved forward, loud and demanding, and for a few hours she almost convinced herself the heat she'd felt had been a trick of the senses. Then evening came, and with it the silence. It pressed against her thoughts in the gaps between sounds, and in that quiet she felt it again. Not heat this time, but absence, like a fire she could sense only because it was no longer near. Without admitting it to herself, she found her steps turning toward the tavern. The moment she crossed the threshold, the warmth returned, faint but unmistakable, and her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. He was there, in the same corner, same book, same careful stillness, as if the world had paused and waited for her. He looked up, surprised, then schooled his expression into something neutral. "You came back," he said. "I got thirsty," she replied too quickly. She sat down, and the fire surged in greeting, stronger than before, then settled into a steady burn that made the air feel thick but manageable. Raska clenched her jaw. "It reacts to me," she muttered. He nodded. "It reacts to attention," he corrected gently. "You give it that." The honesty stung. Around them, the tavern roared, oblivious, and Raska felt a flare of irritation at how easily life ignored what didn't inconvenience it. "You didn't ask me to stay," she said. "I didn't think you would," he replied. There was no accusation in it, only acceptance. That somehow hurt the most. She found herself talking then, about patrols, about a fight that had gone poorly, about a scar she'd earned years ago and never bothered to explain. He listened with the same careful attention he gave his books, asking questions not out of politeness but genuine curiosity. The fire responded to the exchange, steadying, as if conversation itself anchored it. Hours passed without either of them noticing. When she finally stood to leave, the heat protested immediately, pulling at her in a way that made her teeth grit. She paused, hand resting on the table. "This isn't pity," she said, unsure why the distinction mattered so much. He looked up at her, eyes soft. "I know," he said. "Pity is loud." She nodded once, satisfied. As she walked away, the warmth faded gradually, reluctantly, like embers cooling rather than extinguishing. Outside, the night air felt too cold. Raska understood then that the mistake she'd made wasn't sitting down beside him in the first place. It was coming back, and realizing that leaving was already becoming harder than staying. Raska tried to solve the problem the only way she knew how, by doing something. She trained harder, hit heavier, pushed her body until sweat stung her eyes and her muscles trembled with the promise of exhaustion. If the fire inside the human, his name, she realized with a twinge of irritation, she still hadn't asked, was a thing that could be fought, then she would find the angle to strike it from. She questioned healers who owed her favors, warriors who had faced curses in the deep marches, even a hedge mage who smelled of damp earth and lies. Every answer slid off the same way. Some shook their heads. Some offered prayers. One laughed and told her to enjoy the time she had. None gave her a blade to swing. The knowledge sat wrong in her chest, heavier than any armor. That night, when she returned to the iron mug, the fire greeted her with a restless surge, hotter than before, as if it sensed her frustration. The human, Aaron, he finally told her when she snapped at him for withholding it, noticed immediately. "You're angry," he said, not accusing, just observant. She dropped into the chair beside him, the heat pressing in like a living weight. "I hate problems I can't hit," she growled. Aaron smiled faintly. "Then this one is well matched against you." The fire pulsed at that, almost amused, and Raska clenched her fists under the table. "I asked people," she admitted. "The ones who deal with things like this." His fingers stilled on the page. And they don't know how to stop it," she said flatly. "Or they won't say." Aaron nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already believed. "They never do," he said. "At first, they promise. Then they explain why it's impossible. Eventually, they stop explaining." The calm in his voice scraped at her nerves. "You're too accepting," she snapped. "You should be furious." He looked up then, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I was," he said. "For a long time. Anger burns faster than the curse. I couldn't afford both." The fire surged at the truth of it, and Raska felt a sharp, unwelcome admiration. She leaned back, breathing carefully, sweat beading along her hairline. "So that's it," she said. "I sit here and watch you fade." Aaron shook his head. "You sit," he corrected. "That's already more than most." The simplicity of it unsettled her. Staying felt like doing nothing, like weakness disguised as kindness. Yet the fire told a different story. When she was there, it steadied, less volatile, less cruel. When she left, it raged harder, as if offended by the absence. The realization made her stomach twist. "You shouldn't depend on that," she said quietly. "On me." Aaron's smile softened, tinged with something like sadness. "I don't," he replied. "But the fire notices patterns, even if I pretend not to." Raska stared at the hearth, watching flames consume logs with mindless hunger, and felt something inside her crack. All her strength, every scar, every victory, meant nothing here. She could not punch time. She could not intimidate a curse. The only thing she could do was sit, speak, and refuse to look away. The thought humbled her more than any defeat. As the night wore on, she found herself adjusting without thinking, angling her chair so the heat didn't spike, slowing her breathing so the fire followed suit. Aaron's shoulders eased. His voice grew steadier. She realized then that strength wasn't always about saving someone. Sometimes it was about learning how to stand beside them when saving was impossible, and choosing to stay anyway. Raska stopped pretending that sitting beside Aaron was enough. Staying had steadied the fire, yes, but it had not slowed it, and the nights were growing harder to hide. He tired faster now, words sometimes slipping out of order, breath hitching when the heat surged too suddenly. The thought that this was the best the world had to offer him, quiet endurance until the end, made something feral stir in her chest. Orcs did not accept slow deaths without challenging the thing that caused them, even when the challenge was foolish. Especially then, she began asking the questions people didn't like, in places where answers were buried under superstition and fear. Old clan halls, abandoned shrines, a shaman who lived beyond the river and charged silence instead of coin. When Raska returned to the Iron Mug days later, the smell of old smoke clung to her armor and her eyes burned with lack of sleep. The fire inside Aaron reacted instantly, surging hot and sharp, then settling as she took her seat. He noticed the change in her before she spoke. "You went looking," he said quietly. She nodded. "For things the city pretends don't exist." The shaman had named the curse the same way the scholars did, living ember, but where books ended in inevitability, the old stories whispered of bends in the flame. Not cures, never cures, but alterations, sharing, anchoring, moving fire from one vessel to another so it did not consume a single body alone. "You shouldn't," Aaron said when she told him, voice tight with a fear she had never heard from him before. "Those stories don't end well." The fire flared violently at his words, rattling cups on the table. Raska leaned forward, grounding herself, refusing to retreat. "Neither does dying quietly," she said. "At least this gives it a shape." Aaron shook his head. "It gives you a grave," he replied. The truth of it hit hard. The shaman had not lied. Anyone who took the fire would burn faster. Stronger emotions. Shorter life. A trade, brutal and final. Raska felt the weight of that choice settle in her bones, heavier than any weapon she had ever carried. "I'm not asking you to save me," Aaron said, voice low. "I'm asking you not to destroy yourself for a hope that isn't real." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Hope doesn't have to be real to matter," she said. "It just has to be chosen." The fire pulsed between them, not raging now, but listening. Raska understood then that the most dangerous thing she had found wasn't the ritual itself. It was the possibility that, when the time came, she might not hesitate to pay its price. The night Raska accepted what she was doing, she stopped counting how many times Aaron's breath faltered. She had learned the rhythm of the living ember well enough now to recognize when it merely stirred and when it clawed for more. This night, it was restless, heat pressing outward in waves that made the air shimmer faintly around him. Aaron tried to hide it, as he always did, straightening his posture, keeping his voice steady, pretending the effort did not cost him anything. Raska let him pretend. She sat closer instead, close enough that the fire responded to her presence, easing from a snarl into a contained burn. The tavern's noise faded to background hum, replaced by the sound of his breathing and the low crackle of the hearth. "You don't have to watch this," Aaron murmured after a long silence. You've done enough. Raska shook her head. Watching is the point, she replied. The words surprised her with their certainty. She ordered water he drank in careful sips, food he barely touched, and stayed long after the barmaid began shooting them irritated looks. Time stretched, heavy and slow, and Raska felt each minute like a weight added to her spine. This was not a battle she could rush. When Aaron's hands began to shake, she placed her own near them, not touching, just close enough that the heat settled. He closed his eyes, relief flickering across his face before he could hide it. You anchor it, he admitted quietly. I think it notices when you're here. The admission tightened her chest. Then it can notice something else, she said. That you're not alone. The fire pulsed in agreement, not raging, not retreating, simply present. Raska realized then that staying was no longer about curiosity or defiance. It was about witness, about refusing the comfort of distance, refusing to let his suffering remain invisible just because it made others uneasy. When the tremors passed and Aaron slumped back, exhausted but breathing evenly, Raska stayed where she was, ignoring the ache in her muscles and the sweat cooling on her skin. If it ends soon, he said softly, not meeting her eyes, I don't want you blaming yourself. Raska snorted. If it ends soon, she replied, I'll blame the fire. The faint smile that tugged at his lips was worth the cost of staying. When they finally stood to leave, the pull between them was immediate, the heat protesting the distance with an ache that made her grit her teeth. Outside, the night air felt too cold, too empty. Raska understood then that the line had been crossed completely. She was no longer sitting beside a dying man out of chance or stubbornness. She was choosing, night after night, to stand at the edge of the fire and refuse to step away. Even knowing that the closer she stood, the more likely it was that the flames would eventually claim her too. The quarry beyond the river was older than the city, its stone walls blackened by fires no one remembered lighting. Raska chose it because nothing there pretended to be safe. The night air was sharp, biting at her skin as she carved the ritual markings into the ground, each line etched with deliberate care. Aaron stood at the center of the circle, breathing shallowly, the living ember raging now without subtlety, heat rolling off him in visible distortion. He watched her with a mixture of fear and resignation that made her chest tighten. You don't have to do this, he said again, voice hoarse. I know, Raska replied without looking up. I want to. The fire surged at her words, testing the circle, snarling like a living thing. The shaman's warnings echoed in her mind. Fire moved towards strength willingly, but it demanded payment without mercy. When she stepped into the circle with him, the heat slammed into her like a wall, pain ripping through muscle and bone as if her body were being judged and found wanting. She did not retreat. She opened herself instead, grounding her stance, breathing through the agony the way she had through broken ribs and deep wounds. You were never meant to carry this alone, she said, meeting Aaron's gaze as the fire tore at them both. The ritual did not begin with chance, but with truth. Raska spoke first, naming what she was giving up. Years she might never live, battles she would never fight, a future shortened and sharpened by flame. Aaron followed, voice shaking as he named the fear he had lived with since the curse awakened, the nights he waited for it to finish him while pretending he was already gone. When their hands touched, the living ember screamed. Fire exploded outward, rattling the quarry walls, burning paths through Raska's nerves as it resisted division. She felt it try to break her, to drive her back with pain, and she let it burn through her without fighting. Strength was not resistance, she realized. It was endurance. Suddenly, the pressure shifted. The fire wrenched itself free from Aaron in violent surges, leaving him gasping as the heat tore into Raska's chest like a star collapsing. She cried out once, a sound torn from her despite herself, and then the fire folded inward, contained but immense. Silence fell so hard it rang. Aaron collapsed to his knees, breath coming in ragged sobs. Not pain, but shock. The air around him cooled. He stared at his hands, flexed his fingers, and laughed in disbelief. It's gone, he whispered. Raska swayed, vision tunneling, the fire roaring inside her with terrifying clarity. Every heartbeat thundered. Every emotion burned too bright. Aaron caught her before she fell, hands steady, no heat flaring beneath his touch. Raska, he said, terrified. She forced a grin. Looks like the fire finally learned to share. As dawn crept over the quarry, the truth settled between them. Aaron would live. Raska would burn. And neither of them would ever be alone with the fire again. The iron mug felt smaller when Raska returned, as if the walls themselves sensed the fire she carried and leaned inward in caution. The air was sharper to her now, every scent distinct, every sound edged with meaning, and she had to steady her breathing to keep the living ember from flaring in response. Aaron walked beside her, unburdened for the first time since she'd known him, his steps lighter, his posture no longer arranged around pain. The sight of it struck her harder than any blow. They took the same corner table, the same worn bench where everything had begun, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The memory of the joke, of her boredom, her arrogance, hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. "You sat down to scare me," Aaron said softly, a trace of humor in his voice. Raska snorted. "You didn't flinch." The fire pulsed, amused, and she clenched her jaw until it settled. "I thought you were fearless," she continued. "Turns out you were just already living with worse." Aaron met her gaze, gratitude and guilt warring in his eyes. "I never wanted you to pay for my life," he said. Raska leaned back, letting the fire warm her without letting it rule her. "I didn't pay," she replied. "I chose." The distinction mattered. Around them, the tavern carried on, patrons glancing their way and then quickly looking elsewhere, unsettled by something they couldn't name. Aaron reached into his coat and placed a small, scorched bookmark on the table, its edges blackened but intact. "This survived," he said. "It doesn't burn anymore." Raska picked it up, surprised by its coolness. "Some things do," she said, tapping her chest. The fire answered with a steady glow. Silence stretched, comfortable and honest. Raska understood the cost now with painful clarity. Her life would be shorter, her emotions sharper, her days more intense. The living ember would take its due, but it would not take her without purpose. "I don't know how long you'll have," Aaron said quietly. "Neither do I," Raska replied. "But I know how I'll spend it." She met his eyes, unflinching. "I sat down because I was bored. I stayed because you mattered. I burned so you don't have to." The fire pulsed in agreement. Not hungry, not cruel, just present. Aaron placed his hand over hers. Warmth without pain, connection without fear. "Then let this be the vow," he said. "We live honestly with what we chose." Raska squeezed his hand. Outside, the city breathed on, unaware of the promise being forged in its shadow. Inside the iron mug, a joke had become a vow, sealed in fire and will, a promise to live fiercely, together, for as long as the flame allowed.